Hey, this is Matt once again. Welcome back to another video. This is another paid request, this time from my good friend John, the Zero Cool. Thank you very much, man. And for those interested in requesting any type of videos, topics, reactions, commentaries, reviews, re-reviews, what have you, feel free to send it either directly to my PayPal or join my Patreon. Both links are down below in the info box. Now, he was asking, which do I prefer? 80's action films or 90's action films as a topic? And I'll be honest, I know some they answer in 5 seconds, but for me it took a little bit to answer because I actually like a lot of 90's action films because that's when you were really diving, especially the early part, in American martial arts films. I mean, it started in the late 80's, like 88, with, of course, before they used to start with Chuck Norris, in America, at least. But then Bloodsport and Above the Law in 1988. But when you got to 1990, 91, 92, that's when you would see other Jean-Claude Van Damme films, not just martial arts, but action films like Double Impact, Universal Soldier, Hard Target, Time Cop, Steven Seagal, Out for Justice, Marked for Death, Under Siege, and then you have Stallone. Like, okay, martial arts, like, you see more Jeff Speakman, like The Perfect Weapon, Daily Outbreak. You see Gary Daniels, and more of his work. Jeff Wincott, more of his work. You see even more of the work of PM Entertainment that did start in the 80's, but their heyday was really the 90's. And doing films like Zero Tolerance with Robert Patrick and Riot with Gary Daniels, Last Man Standing with Jeff Wincott, and Zero Tolerance with Robert Patrick. I might have misspoke. Robert Patrick was in Zero Tolerance, and Riot with Gary Daniels. Just a lot of good stuff in there. And the bigger movies, he had, like, Hard Target is my favorite, and that was in the 90's. You had Cliffhanger, you had Demolition Man, you had Eraser, you had True Lies, of course, Terminator 2. So you have a lot of damn good action films in the 90's. So that's why it was very hard to pick, but I had to choose the 80's. I would say the 90's is the most underrated decade. Because people always crap on the 90's, whether for horror films, for action films. People always put the 90's under the bus, and I'm like, there's no reason for that. You won't put something under the bus, put today or the 2010s under the bus. That doesn't mean there were some good films there, don't get me wrong. Dread, The Raid Redemption in the 2010s. But the 90's, like, I haven't even begun mentioning all the action films like Speed. And then different types of action films like Twister and Independence Day. There are different types of action films, but there's action in them. That even goes into horror. Like, people say horror is such a bad decade in the 90's horror. I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, it began with Tremors, Graveyard Shift, Jacob's Ladder, you know, The First Power. You got Death Machine, you got The Relic, you got Deep Rising, you got Steve D's It with Tim Curry. It ends with House on Haunted Hill remake and the Blair Witch Project, and like, Dr. Diddles is in there. Like, there's a lot of 90's horror films. In the Mouth of Madness, The People Under the Stairs. There's a lot of 90's horror I enjoy. And same with action. Speed with Keanu Reeves. But again, the 90's is a great decade for action. Broken Arrow, like I keep mentioning, like, I do want to say the 90's because there's so much, but I'm going to say the 80's because the 80's, you have those quintessential movies for me. Rambo First Blood Part 2. Aliens. Die Hard. RoboCop. Lethal Weapon. Predator. And then the 90's have Predator 2. But like I mentioned those films, and it's like when I mentioned those films, when I mentioned Aliens and the Rambo trilogy. The Rambo trilogy was in the 80's. And I mentioned The Terminator, which is my favorite Terminator film. I mentioned RoboCop. I mentioned Lethal Weapon, 48 Hours. Outland with Sean Connery, which is a little bit kind of an action film in a way, sort of a high noon in space type of thing, sci-fi. It's hard to compete with it. Beverly Hills Cop, where you just see so many more like quintessential classics. I think the early 90's helped because they were influenced by the 80's. Just, it seems like the first couple years of the decade after is influenced by the decade before. Like even the 80's, you look at 1980, look at 1981, there's still a little bit of that 70's influence. Even Prom Night that came out in 1980, they're dancing with the disco music and the disco ball. Like I said, there's still that 70's feel, and then it filtered out to the 80's, its own decade. Same with the 90's. I think the first, Hard Target and Hard Boiled, John Woo 92, Hong Kong, Cliffhanger Demolition, like in the first couple years had that 80's feel, mentality, machismo, and I'm going all over the place. One of the aspects that I did of the 80's is when it got into the 90's, the second half, from like 95 onward, there's still a lot of action films I do like, don't get me wrong. Love Daily Outbreak, wish it had a bigger budget with Jess Speakman, but I love that film. Like, love Eraser with Arnold, but yet some CGI, like the crappy gator, alligator thing. And that's the thing is, when we got to mid 90's onward, we were seeing less of my favorite type of action films, which are the either one-man army, martial arts, that type of centered stuff. That was coming way more to the wayside, way more to this side, where it was going to be less and less used, especially when you got into the 2000s. But that was starting in the 90's because of the success of films like Jurassic Park. And they go, wow, you have this big event movie. It doesn't have a big action star in it. It's got Sam Neill. Oh, we have Independence Day. Doesn't have a big action star. It's got Will Smith at the time from Prince of Bel-Air. And look, he was in the first Bad Boys. You got Jeff Goldblum, Bill Pullman, Twister, love Twister. But you saw studios felt that we don't need an action hero, or we don't need that type of excess. It was much more getting into computer graphics, CGI. At least at the time they were meshing practical with CG. Like you look at Independence Day, a lot of that still looks good because of the model work and such, but we're now getting more and more to CGI. Like Mortal Kombat, especially as I love the 95 Mortal Kombat, there's some really bad CGI in that. And that's now coming into the fold. And so while in the second half of that decade there's a lot of action films to enjoy, but with some caveats, some asterisks behind it. I enjoy it, except the CGI is bad. I enjoy it, but that doesn't hold up the best. But they did what they could at the time with the technology they had. And like I said, from 95 onward, there are a lot of action films I enjoy. It's just, they're not on the pinnacle of the Die Hards and the Rambos and the Terminator and all that jazz. Definitely much less about action heroes and more about being effects-driven spectacles. And you saw a lot more of that with The Matrix, which I do enjoy that film, and then of course that leaked into the 2000s with Lord of the Rings, Spider-Man, all that jazz. The 80's, on the other hand, was excess. Excess on everything. I think that's one of the things people either don't realize or don't think about, or they do realize and think about, is one of the reasons the 80's worked was excess was not only wanted, but for many people felt like needed, whether it be the cocaine, the money, fast cars, hot women, big guns, bigger explosions, machismo, one-liners, violence, amp up the practical effects, amp up the makeup effects, amp up the explosions, bigger biceps, bigger kicks, like, blood sport. And that's why the 80s to me is I have to pick over the 90s, despite how much I love the 90s. Because look at the 80s, I go, that introduced the Rambo films to me, which I love all four Rambo films, and the main three are in the 80s. First Blood, Rambo First Blood Part 2 is my childhood. Rambo 3 is my childhood. I love Rambo First Blood Part 2. To me, is easily one of my favorite films, one of my favorite actions of all time. To me, Rambo First Blood Part 2 is quintessential iconic. The C4 tipped explosive arrow, the Murdoch, I'm coming to get you, the helicopter, the machine gun, like just everything about it. Aliens is in that decade. Aliens did one of my all-time favorite films. Cobra, underrated as hell. Like, this poster tells you the 80s. Like, if there's a poster that tells you the 80s, this does. Crime is Disease, Meet the Cure, the poster, the sunglasses, the gun, the badass. That's the 80s in a nutshell. And I love Cobra to death. They didn't. You look at how Lethal Weapon and RoboCop and Predator all came out the same year. You look at your films like Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York. So we have a decade that Stallone was around in the 70s, of course, but I think the 80s really brought him even, and 70s brought him to shine to the Rocky, the Oscars. But as an action star, the 80s was brought him to prime. Because in the 70s, understandably, he is a good actor, he wanted to go in that direction. In the 80s, he went more into the action realm. So you get his films, it started in the 80s. Rocky 3, Rocky 4, Rambo trilogy, and then doing films like Tango and Cash. And, well, I wouldn't call Over the Top an action film. That's more a good drama. But you did more of that. You did Arnold. I mean, he had done some stuff in the 70s, but the 80s were Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, and then Predator, The Running Man. That's when Arnold comes into fruition. Chuck Norris. I mean, he was doing stuff in the 70s, of course, with Bruce Lee and others, but it was the 80s with Cannon Films and such that really brought him up to par. Missing in Action films, Code of Silence, for me, you have Firewalker, Invasion USA, Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis's moonlighting, the 80s would brought him, like, you think of the 80s, how they brought so many people up that we recognize in the action genre. Again, Chuck Norris was in the 70s before, but the 80s, I think, with Delta Force and all the films I mentioned, Lone Wolf McQuade, brought him up, the prominence in that. Same with Stallone, same with Arnold. I mean, Arnold had done stuff like Hercules and, stuff. Now you got Terminator and all that. Van Damme, introduced in the 80s. Bloodsport. Steven Seagal, when he was worth a crap, introduced in the 80s and Above the Law. Even Jackie Chan was doing stuff in the 70s, but it's really the 80s that really got me and others into his stuff, like Police Story and maybe, for some people, like films like Wheels on Meals. I know for it's the 70s with stuff like Steak and Needles and all that. So maybe for others that'd be a lesser example, but for me, like I said, I look at all this stuff, and Mel Gibson with there's Mad Max, but the Road Warrior really brought things to a shine, and then Lethal Weapon, that really brought Mel Gibson to the dance, as they call it. So yeah, like Van Damme and Mel Gibson and Bruce Willis and Steven Seagal and Arnold and Sly and Chuck Norris, their prime, you could say, was the 80s. which then helped gravitate into the 90s. And some of them may have started in the 70s, but the 80s again was that prime of just excess and excitement and training, and for some taking their vitamins, and the violence and the one-liners and the crowd pleasers, the absolute fucking crowd pleasers. And you had to do stuff on your own. You had to do stuff in camera. You had to do stuff without CGI, without manipulation of that, without post-production stuff. You had to do stuff in camera with your fists, or with your guns, or with your kicks, or with your wisecracks, like Eddie Murphy and Beverly Hills Cop and 48 Hours. And it was much more raw in the language and violence, and it was much more raw with the women. You could have strip clubs and titties. What was the last major action film to have a strip club with a titty? And Commando. I didn't even mention Commando, of course. And guns, mano a manos, prove our toughness, masculinity, machismo, violence, guns, guns, guns. If cocaine was the drug of the 80s, maybe people should start doing cocaine again. And maybe they chill out and relax. Go back to doing cocaine again. That's when Stephen King was at his best, doing cocaine with stuff like Maximum Overdrive. Now he's just busy bitching on Twitter. Like an idiot. So, like I said, 90s action films, I think, is underrated decade. I could go for 30 minutes on action films in the 90s I love. I mean, I mentioned Predator 2, Die Hard 2, Die Hard with a Vengeance. I said Commando, Cliffhanger, Demolition Man. I'm just repeating myself. Hard Target, of course. But I think what primed the 90s was the 80s. And that's another thing. Without the 80s, you wouldn't have the 90s stuff. Because the 80s primed those action stars I mentioned. The 80s primed Bruce Willis. I did just say the 70s are the same thing, but maybe 70s you say primed a little bit of Arnold doing some stuff they did it in. Same with Stallone. But 80s primed people with explosives to their flap jackets. Flat jackets, slap hackets. They primed it all ready to explode, and when it explodes, they're still there because they're so goddamn tough. Hands of steel and hands of thunder, just. And like I said, you had this excess that was not looked at with a wink and looked as it was genuine because the 80s were our comic book films. They truly were our comic book movies. Larger than life, escapism, fun. Kicking ass, taking names, not worrying about PC, not worrying about politics. These Commando and Cobra and RoboCop and Predator, these were our comic book films. More than fine being R-rated, not having CGI put in there, especially early CGI that doesn't hold up. The practical stuff holds up better because you cannot get more real than real. And with the 80s, unless you're looking at that one young Sherlock Holmes movie and maybe Tron or something, that wasn't computer stuff. That wasn't as prominent. Like it started getting in the 90s. Because successive films like Jurassic Park, then Twister, Independence Day, The Mummy, all that stuff. But it's one of those things where, as a cat's playing with a toy, it was so prominent that that's one of the reasons why the 80s will look back on so fondly, that people keep ripping it off, hoping to get a piece of that history and that success. I mean, how many of these TV shows and movies mention they want to be the 80s or reference to the 80s, and sometimes it works. A lot of times it doesn't. Like, I would say a movie that's well, that's tough. Like I said, there's some movies out there, but you could replicate it, but it's still a replication. You could copy it, but it's still a copy. It's not the real deal. It's not the original. And like I said, well, again, I love the 90s action films. I love them. Like I said, if I had to choose, I had to choose the 80s because of the stuff I mentioned. The excess, the bigger-than-life action heroes. And again, just how many prime examples of classics on a consistent basis. From, again, Rambo 2, First Blood, Rambo 2, Rambo First Blood Part 2, I mean, Aliens, and Big Trouble in Little China, and Die Hard, and RoboCop, and, Total Recall was 1990. But you say Total Recall definitely has an 80s influence with the violence, and Arnold, bigger than life. I miss that stuff. I looked at movies today, and there's movies I like. There's actually quite a few movies I like in today. It's just a lot of people skip them to watch the rants. But hey, at least if they're watching something, I can't complain. It's better than watching something than nothing. But there's a lot of movies. Hell, this year I came up with at least 15 movies so far I liked this year. So it's not like there's zero good movies out. And of course that's subjective. But it's not like how it was in the 90s and 80s. See, the 90s I would call the most underrated decade for action films, and the 80s I would call the best. I didn't need a movie that has a line where this is where the law stops and I start. Sucker. When you got that, and Rambo for Split Part 2, and Aliens, and Die Hard, it's kind of hard for me to not pick that decade. So with that said, thanks for watching. Take care. We'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.